Hi, I'm Josh Bollinger, Communications Coordinator with the Harry R. Hughes Center for Agro-Ecology at the University of Maryland, College of Agriculture and Natural Resources. You're listening to the last episode in a limited series podcast on saltwater intrusion, which is a phenomenon occurring to lands on the Delmarva Peninsula or the coastal parts of Delaware, Maryland, and Virginia. Saltwater intrusion is the landward movement of salt water. Scientists believe this byproduct of sea level rise is impacting coastal areas around the world, changing the chemistry of the soil, and impacting agricultural lands by reducing yields, killing forests, and causing encroachment of saltwater marsh species in these lands. So, in the first two episodes, we met with scientists from the University of Maryland, George Washington University, and the University of Delaware who are researching the extent of saltwater intrusion, its impact on the economy in the area, and mitigation options for farmers. In this episode, we'll hear from Wendell Meekins, who's a farmer in Dorchester County, Maryland, who's experiencing saltwater intrusion in real time. And we also meet Nadia Chahab, who's the Maryland Department of Agriculture's Coordinator of Equity and Climate Initiatives. Before we jump in, I want to thank the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation, which provided a grant to make part of this research and this podcast happen. The saltwater intrusion research on the Delmarva Peninsula is also supported by grants from the U.S. Department of Agriculture, National Institute of Food and Agriculture, and the National Science Foundation, with some of the work also being supported by Hughes Center grants. So now, thanks for listening, and on to the show. So could you introduce yourself for me?
Sure. So my name's Nadia Chahab. I am from the Maryland Department of Agriculture. I am their new Climate and Equity Initiatives Coordinator under the Resource Conservation Office.
Oh, that's excellent. How long you been with MDA for?
Less than a year, maybe 8 months.
Have you been in Maryland for long, or?
Yeah. I grew up in Maryland for the most part, so very familiar. I went to University of Maryland, went to Hopkins, so I've got the blue crab running through my veins as much as everyone else does.
That's good to hear. So, what do you do at MDA? You mentioned your title, but why don't you go into a little bit about what you do?
Sure. So, with the new Moore administration and with just in general, if you're following federal policies, there's this thing called the Justice 40 initiatives, where it's focusing on climate justice and environmental justice in historically underserved and overburdened communities. So the Moore administration also has an emphasis on environmental justice, which when you go into the history of the state, it's rightfully so. So a lot of the state agencies have an initiative. Part of the initiative with the Moore administration and the state agencies is implementing environmental justice coordinators at all of the agencies. So I've got counterparts at MDA, DNR. They have a new resilience officer, and that's out of the governor's office. And a lot of that is just making sure that we're taking a look at our programs, our grant funding, our technical and financial assistance, and how do we make that more equitable and accessible to communities that have historically just not had access to them. And I tell people this, environmental justice is not a new movement. It's not a new social movement. It's been around for decades. As long as there's been injustice, there's been environmental injustice. And I think coming into the age where it's our social responsibility to rectify those, or at least work towards rectifying those and giving communities access to the resources, whether that's financial, technical, or even just like a buddy in the system to help them become equal in all terms.
Are there particular areas of the state you work in more often, and what type of things are they dealing with?
So MDE has a environmental justice screen mapping tool online, and it's pretty good at giving you all like the designated regions. Now, if you look at like the federal definition versus the state definition, they differ a little bit. It's just because it's based on census tracts, but historically underserved, overburdened, those are two categories. Overburden has 21 characteristics where I believe the population has to fall under, I want to say this, they have to hit the 75th percentile, and environmental factors. So that's like proximity to hazardous waste, that's proximity to pollution, how many like health defects there. So that's like asthma, rates of like cardio infarct, like heart attacks, stuff like that.
Mm.
And then it's also looking at what's like the median, like is English a second language? What's the literacy rate? Stuff like that. It's we want to make sure that all our communities have access to resources, and I think addressing historical bias, whether that's racial demographics, whether that's socially and economic demographics, is a big thing. And I think approaching those programs and the way we've redlined parts of the country, parts of our state, is also important in that conversation.
So this whole series is focused sort of around climate issues, sea level rise related to saltwater intrusion. So where does all that fit into, your role?
I think climate, and I kind of play in both fields. I do climate and I do the environmental justice thing. But I think more often than not, when I talk about it, I tell people all the time that climate and environmental justice they go hand in hand. Are those same demographics, they're going to be at the forefront of the climate injustice. So they're usually the ones who feel it the hardest. And I think it's our due diligence to make sure that they're prepared and that all our communities are resilient, not just the ones that have resources, but the ones who actually need them the most.
Mm-hmm. Right. So what do you do around you personally in your role around this issue of saltwater intrusion? Like how involved are you? What's going on in that? I guess what I'm trying to get at is it's clearly something on the forefront of researchers' minds and farmers' minds in like coastal agro like ecosystems on the Eastern Shore. So where is that like within the radar for MDA?
So we work with our research partners to understand the science part. We work with our state partners like DNR to align expertise and stuff like that. And we as we've seen saltwater intrusion occurring and we've seen the rate at which it's increasing, we're working with those same partners to kind of take note where the inundation is happening and to the extent to which it's happening. And I talk about like conservation partnerships often, and it's not just with our state agencies, it's with the farmers as well. We do it through the state, we do it through federal partners, whether that's the USDA or NRCS. And again, outside agencies like UMD, University of Delaware, people like that. Because ultimately our goal with saltwater intrusion is to prepare farmers and help farmers address their farm conservation goals. And that's what the department and that's what Resource Conservation Office has been doing for decades. So that it's been on our radar, definitely.
Okay. So it's sort of like baked into sort of that resource conservation program.
Yeah. So myself and a colleague, we sit on a couple different collaboration work groups, whether that's the adaptation resiliency work group. I'm not sure how familiar you are. Yeah. Both me and my colleagues sit on that. We sit on, and part of that is the state adaptation, like saltwater intrusion plan.
Through the Department of Planning.
Yeah, that came out in 2019, and it's supposed to be updated, I believe, soon. We sit on wetland action committees. More recently, we've been doing the steering committee for like climate vulnerability assessments. And one of the more recent committees is we do like an diversity, equity, inclusion committee for the Critical Area Commission. That's more community and people centric. And that's supposed to address like all those kind of communities that are facing the critical area. Good documentaries about those. If you've seen, you can Google erosion or Smithville. Those are specifically about African American Black communities on the lower Eastern Shore and what they're facing with saltwater intrusion and the flooding. Yeah.
So that leads me to this next question is that let's say I'm a farmer on the lower Eastern Shore. I think I know the answer to I personally know the answer, but I wonder if you could help like explain sort of where do you first turn to if you need help for something like this?
For us, the first place we're going to tell you is to start with your soil conservation district.
Yeah.
Those are typically co-housed with other agencies, including typically people from MDA. So they're your technical assistant hub. This is actually very intentional on our part. It allows for like the resources to kind of be in one area. And then it kind of lets itself work its way back up to like us at headquarters, just kind of as like a, I guess like a level system. But also like any of our conservation partners, I'm sure there's people at DNR and MDE that you could reach out to as well. And we're in constant contact. That's a big thing with this administration as well, as making sure that the sister agencies are just speaking to each other. Because climate justice and climate change, it's not a singular effort. It's really on all of us to help. Yeah, and then we are constantly looking to increase cost share efforts and incentives, kind of for those same farmers to install and implement high priority conservation best management practices.
Do you know of any that are any incentives that are new or up and comings? Like particularly?
So any BMPs are typically from a plan that's like already established. I don't believe they have any plans to update those currently.
Oh, so they're the established best
Yeah,
management
yeah.
practices. Because the reason I asked is because part of this research is like looking into mitigation strategies for saltwater intrusion. So it's like, I spent a lot of time thinking about how to turn research into practical.
Mm-hmm.
You're able to actually use it in the field.
Mm-hmm.
So, I like to try to make sure, and I hear you talking about like sitting on all these committees, and people not in the government system don't know how like important it is sometimes to sit in these committee hearings, because you don't really get a chance to talk to a lot of these people every day,
Mm-hmm.
and sometimes like the information sharing could be vital. So I where I'm leading with this is like saltwater intrusion isn't necessarily stuck on the eastern shore of Maryland.
Mm-hmm.
We're seeing it in areas, all of Delmarva, North Carolina, stuff like that. What type of information sharing happens across states?
Quite a bit. We work on different grants things with partners across the state. We recently, I don't quite remember who was talking about this, but we've seen, and we were told that farmers, when facing kind of like that increasing salinization in their soils, have kind of been trying out different crops, whether that's like barley or sorghum, like salt tolerant soy or switchgrass. So I know a couple of our farmers have already started kind of trying out those crops to see what's going on. But yeah.
Yeah. And then it leads into, and I discussed this a little bit with Wendell, was that it leads into, then you have to find markets for that and whatnot. And I mean, does MDA consider that type of stuff too? After the fact, we got to try these new things. Is there a market for it?
Yeah, so ultimately at the end of the day, it's our job to consider the farmer and the individual. So we want to make sure that the farmers stay profitable. And if that's going to be an avenue that we have to help farmers with, I think that's probably going to be something that happens in the future.
Yeah, because you think of changing like agriculture systems over time.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe on the lower shore, corn won't be able to be grown anymore at some point in the future. So, how do you adjust a whole market?
That's the question, isn't it?
It's a really, yeah.
And I think that's a big question right now that no one really has an answer to.
Yeah.
As I know, when I talk about agriculture in general, I tell people it's, for the first time, the United States is importing more than we're exporting, and no one really knows how to rectify that. We want to bring agriculture back to the States, and it's just like a changing market. And so that is definitely a big problem we want to tackle. And that's going to have to, an answer that's going to have to just keep evolving as time goes on.
Yeah, no, there's definitely no solid answer for that yet. I don't suspect there will be. Just like anything, yeah, you have to adapt as challenges come, right? So then looking into the near future, I suppose, what's your plans within your role to look at this issue of saltwater intrusion, and how do we move the needle forward on this?
So my role is continuously growing as I figure out kind of where my focus lies, but saltwater intrusion is not necessarily like a new issue. It's like I said earlier, what's newer is the science and the tools that we have that are helping us kind of refine where it's happening to the degree it's happening. So I know there's probably going to be like some saltwater action groups that are coming up, and as we work to like kind of move policy in that direction to work to help those farmers that are out there and just the land out there. And I think in light of climate change with the state, saltwater intrusions may be just only part of the conversation that we need to start having. And as we approach our 2025 goals for the Chesapeake Bay, we're definitely thinking about conservation from a co-benefit lens. So it's how do we create programs, how do we facilitate programs that limit nitrogen production while also sequestering carbon, while also encouraging the biodiversity or increasing biodiversity. And then also, what about the communities in those areas? We want to take all of that into consideration.
That's interesting, is because that also leads me to my last question is about sort of how do you stay up to date. There's a lot of science pushing through even my organization, and what we do is research, and we have a hard time keeping on top of everything, all the research happening all over the place. Is that something that you find challenging as well? I mean, that seems critical to your role.
Yeah, I'm not the only person that does climate at MDA, so that's helpful. And I think what's also very helpful is that climate and climate change and advocating for the climate is something that's baked into a lot of our programs. So if I don't see a paper, I have a colleague that sees a paper and passes it on to me. So we really do look at it's really a group effort at MDA. We're like a small but really mighty team. And I know we look to Dr. Kate Tully a lot. She's at the forefront of it. We look at the University of Delaware. And I mentioned our soil conservation districts earlier. They're actually such a critical part of our feedback loop because they're the ones hearing directly from the producers, and they're relaying that back to us at MDA. And that really allows us to take that information that they're sharing with us and kind of synthesize it into our programs and the efforts that make sense for the producers.
Yeah. Well, is there anything else you want to add? I mean, I think this has been a good conversation.
I think with all the efforts for saltwater intrusion and climate change that come out from the state, I think it's really easy to think of them as from an environmental lens, right? An environmental advocacy lens. And I think it's very easy to get caught up in these big environmental goals that everyone wants to achieve, right? Mitigating saltwater intrusion affects all of us. We all have an added benefit in that. But I think everyone wants to achieve these goals, and we can take these marginal lands out of production to achieve these goals, but at MDA, we don't want to lose sight of the impacts that this has on the farmer, the business, and their communities, right? Because some of these farmers have had these farms for generations. They're families, it's a family business. They're historical parts of the state that are dedicated to agriculture. So we sit in these groups, and we're always very cognizant of the fact that at the end of the day, MDA, the Department of Ag, we're there to advocate for the producer at the farm field level and their needs. So what we constantly want to ask ourselves is, how do we support a producer that is in that transition to take their land out of production? And how do we support them through that when the land might not be productive anymore?
Yeah. So thanks for joining me today. Why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself? Tell me a little bit about where you farm and what you farm.
Yes, sir. My name is Wendell Meekins. I'm a Dorchester County grain and poultry farmer. I farm throughout Dorchester County, from northern Dorchester County to southern Dorchester County.
How long you been doing that for?
About 25 years.
25 years?
Yes, sir.
When did you get started in that? What led you to that?
I married into it. My wife was she's a third generation farmer in Dorchester, and I married into it, and now I've taken over management of her home farm, and I have a branch off of my own that I do my own farming with.
Have you always been down in Dorchester? Did you grow up in?
Yes,
on the shore?
Born and raised, yes, sir.
So we're talking about all this sort of has to do with a changing landscape. Is that this research into saltwater intrusion? Is that something that you have seen yourself? Have you seen? You're seeing farm fields completely impacted by.
Yes, well, being a lifelong resident of Dorchester County, you've always seen tidal events and grown up around tide and sea level rise and saltwater intrusion. But in the last 2 years, I can definitely adamantly say that there is something going on here that high tides now are a normal cycle. It doesn't go down anymore, and especially in this last year. We've a high tide event now is detrimental to transportation, farming, everything. And then on a low tide cycle, it's what high tide used to be. And this past year, I'm not a big proponent of sea level rise, but you cannot deny it after something's happening over the last year. It's just got tremendously worse. I had an event last year that on a farm that is in southern Dorchester County. It's in Madison. And I have some tidal events on a northern part of that farm that's near the river. But last year, just out of nowhere on a moon cycle, we got just a flood tide that came up on a dry cycle that the water was just inundated with salt at that time. Mm-hmm. And it has changed that farm. That farm will never be the same now. There are still to this, it's a year ahead now, and there's still areas of this farm that just are totally bare. They won't even grow grass anymore because of the salt. And it came from an event where I was going to plant corn on this farm, and I had worked the ground and tilled it and got it ready for planting, and I planted my crop, and my crop came up, and then so it was in a dry time of year, so that ground was like a sponge.
Thirsty.
It just took everything up, and it was all salt that it took up. And Kate Tully has come down, Dr. Kate Tully from University of Maryland. She came down and she did some studies there, and now it's pretty much changed it into what a wetland would be. The salt in the soil. So
yeah, how do you plan for something like that? That's got to be tough. And that's just started. So that just saltwater intrusion issues. You just started sort of recently experiencing this with a freak tide. It sounds like
in a field on that farm that is very, very seldomly had a problem with salt. Huh. And another problem we're finding is subsurface saltwater intrusion. So now, I don't know if you're familiar with it or not, but if you used to dig a hole, especially in Dorchester County, if you dug a hole 2 feet deep, that hole had water in the bottom of it. That in the past, that water was fresh. Well, now that water is salt water. So in that top aquifer of water there, now, so a plant that goes down to get, when a plant would happen to have to go deeper with its roots, now it's going into a salt water feeding system.
Yeah.
And it's killing the plants. So it's in some parts of Dorchester we're finding.
Yeah. So it's just turning into marsh species.
Yes, it is.
Wow.
Yep.
So what do you grow grain, corn, soybean rotation type deal, or?
Corn, soybean, wheat, milo.
Yeah. Are you finding, are you finding any of those, or any of those crops are doing better than, or is it just like the corn is doing worse, or how's it?
Well,
it depends on where you're planting it, I guess.
You can get a bean that's genetically modified with a salt excluder in it.
Mm-hmm.
So it excludes the salt out of the bean, and that's supposed to grow in, it's supposed to tolerate salt, but not in this amount. And the thing about it is when we do studies as a university, we have to remember that from my point of view, everything has to be profitable.
Absolutely.
It has to yield. It can't only grow. It has to go through its entire life cycle, and it has to fruit and yield, or if it's not, then I can't afford to justify that into my operation. And a lot of these lands are becoming less and less and less profitable every year, and crop insurance just isn't going to cover it after a while.
And then there's the question is, like, even if you find something that would grow well, could you market it? I mean, that's always the next question is, like, I forget what they were trying to plant, but the question was, would they be able to sell it then, after it's grown?
That's right. Finding a new market. And we have found a new market in Dorchester and some parts of the Eastern Shore. It's giant miscanthus grass.
That's right.
And I also have a whole farm that's in that giant miscanthus grass that I rent out to the gentleman that does it, John Luthe. And that's a great crop and it's going right now. It's going as poultry bedding, but they're finding that they're going to put this into a pulp now, and they're going to start making paper products out of it because it's such a good biomass. But that again, we've tried that on salt intruded ground, and it just won't produce to be efficient and profitable.
Huh. Interesting. So, how did you get involved in all this university-related research? Do you mind going through that backstory a little bit, or how involved are you right now at this point?
Well, more and more all the time. I guess my name's getting out there.
If you're willing to help,
yeah,
you,
right.
you
Yeah, and that's what's happening more and more. I started with a Sea grant. I had some problems, and I am the chair of the USDA Farm Service Agency committee in Dorchester County.
Oh.
So it started from there, and it built into some informational segments that I was looking for from other individuals. And then Kate Tully came down on the problem that we had in Madison, and it's just grown from there. And I did a Maryland Farm and Harvest segment on it. And
yeah. Do you know what types of things they're looking into specifically, or what are they interested for you?
Dr. Tully is building. Another problem is people think that you can put that ground in CRP, Conservation Preserve Program, or some kind of buffer program.
Yeah.
But the problem with that is finding a species of plant that's going to grow in that saltwater situation, and because Phragmites is a plant that thrives on saltwater, but they don't want that in their buffer, they actually will cite you for having Phragmites in your buffers. So, and it's almost impossible to try to keep something like that out of there because that is a saltwater growing species. So, and Kate's designing some natural vegetation to grow into some of these buffers that will smother out the Phragmites and invasive species. So that's a bright outlook for things in the future, but because now we may be able to put that into a buffer system, or because a lot of what my problems are with salt is on rented ground, so it's leased ground. Well, you can't go to your owner, and say, hey, look, I just can't till this anymore. It's just no good ground. What's it going to do with it? That farm's probably been in it's probably been in tillage for 3 or 4 generations, and now they're finding that they're hitting a roadblock. So
okay, so this is happening on ground you're leasing.
Yes.
Yeah. So then what do you I mean, I guess at some point you have to make a business decision, though, don't you?
Oh,
For
absolutely.
yourself.
Yep. It becomes. Yep. Every year, if you go on your crop insurance, so if I were to get a new farm, I go for 3 years on a county average, and then each year I start developing a yield of my own. So after 3 to 4 years of developing a yield that's very, very low, now there is no crop damage payment. So the financial part of it is just gone. So it's just.
I know we're involved in a lot of research to try to figure out ways to mitigate something like this, and I just don't know whether mitigation would be able to happen at the speed at which is necessary to make.
A large problem that I see is erosion.
Yeah.
I mean, if you think about it, there used to be, and I've seen. I just did a thing with a legislative caucus at the Hyatt. It was a nationwide caucus that came down, and it was legislators and future political leaders. And I did a saltwater intrusion presentation with them. And I had shown where, since 1952 in Dorchester County, we've lost over 5,000 acres to erosion. That has caused water to come up into areas that it didn't used to come up in, and then it flows into creeks that it didn't used to come up in, that were brackish water and now become salt water. And so erosion to me is a large part of this, because now it's letting water in off of shorelines that it didn't used to come up into. And so now you're finding pockets in marshes that are now tidal that used to be just sedentary, so all they got was rainwater, and rainwater come up of them, but now they're tidal. And so I think that's where a large part of the subsurface saltwater is coming from. But
So then the question, I get it's a huge societal change. It seems like, is this a thing to fight or to adapt to?
Yes.
Yeah, adapt to.
Yep, it is. It is adapted to. I mean, it's very, very hard to. Cambridge, actually, the city of Cambridge is actually, they're actually looking to get grants to berm the entire shoreline of Cambridge and put a living shoreline on it. Well, that's all good for Cambridge, but now, what does that do to the people in southern Dorchester now? Because now they have more of a tidal flow, because now it's not going into areas around Cambridge that it's not going into. So to me, that's not a very good solution.
Yeah, could it cause more issues somewhere else? Unintended consequences.
Well,
sure, in an area that's arguably more sensitive.
Well, Kate and I had done a proposal to them. Well, how about if I took, because there's tidal ditches on this farm in Madison, and I said, well, what I want to do here is I want to put a berm all the way around this field, and then I'll put flood pipes in to where it'll let the storm water out, but there's gates that it won't let the salt water in. And then there's, a lot of people's answer with that, well, you're just pushing it farther downstream onto your neighbor. Well, how is Cambridge not doing that also, by berming it? How are they not pushing that off on their neighbor? And that's not a very good solution to me. So, again, it's a sticky situation.
Yeah, imagine. So then what's the topic of discussions? Is this a topic of discussions among other farmers that you know?
Oh, absolutely.
And what are they saying?
If you were to go to Dorchester County now, there are certain portions of Dorchester County in the southern half that are unfarmable. That those lands are just lost. They were saltwater intruded, not profitable to grow on anymore. So now they've grown up in marsh and bushes that would, myrtle bushes that would grow in salt water, and that's becoming more and more prevalent and working its way north every year.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know what can be done. I mean, there's a 50-year study that shows that another fifth of Dorchester County is going to be underwater in 50 years. So.
Mm-hmm. Right. Well, that's not a very positive
way
to end
right.
this. I mean,
well, I am. I mean, somebody looks at this, what is the solution here? Because really, I don't know. I mean,
I couldn't begin to.
And seeing, like I say, seeing this past year, what the difference was in this past year in the tidal cycles. If next year continues like this year did, we're in big trouble. We're going to have to do a lot of changing to farming in these Somerset, Worcester, Dorchester on the eastern shore, and all around the nation. I mean, there's got to be other places like this, just.
Oh yeah, I'm sure coastal areas up and down the eastern seaboard at least. Or,
right.
Yeah. So, it's funny. I was playing like a video game the other day, and they brought up saltwater intrusion, and I never would have thought it was in a video game. It was amazing. But anyway, so then what's you? I guess you can't plan for the very, very far future. You can only really plan for the immediate future. Then, what's your immediate plans for these areas that are being impacted by? Are you going to continue planting corn next year?
Not in some of these areas, no. I mean, it's just when, as a farmer, morally, you don't want to go out and plant something that's not going to grow there. Of course, you have crop insurance on it, and you have a subsidy, but that's just that doesn't work for a lot of people. So yes, we're going to have no choice but to just give up some lands.
Yeah. And that's an unfortunate thing to hear. So, I mean, do you have this is something that, has been in your wife's family, at least for generations and generations and generations. So how does she look at this then?
Oh, the same way. I mean, it's a shame, but we've got to find something else to do with these lands that's somewhat profitable, whether it be mitigation or programs to. I just don't see another problem or another solution to it was, let's not make wetlands, Look around Dorchester County. You don't need any more wetlands. We need to save what farmland that we have. And we're having more and more people come in and develop shallow water areas, shallow water wetlands. And to me, that's not a good solution either.
Yeah, it's one giant mosquito pit out there then.
Right. Yep. Exactly. Yep.
Okay. So, I'm trying to think of if there's any other questions. I could take a pause here for a second.
When you say mitigation.
Oh yeah.
What do you mean in mitigation? I mean.
I guess that's
Yep.
So when we talk about Kate talks about mitigation in her studies a lot.
Uh-huh.
I'm not necessarily sure what particular practice could mitigate salt in a field. In other words, I saw online that there's like some research being done out in China, whether or not it's like completely true or not, Chinese media, but they're pulling like salt out of fields somehow with some practice that they're researching out there. And I don't know whether you're discussing, there's some sort of program where you're losing these areas to marshlands. Is there some sort of, like what Kate's talking about, other species that could mitigate the Phragmites, for instance, in buffers or something like that?
Yes.
So you already sort of hit on that, right? A little bit.
She was very positive on that too. That they were developing that program that was, and it was going. She was pretty sure that it was going to work. That would be a good solution, because conservation reserve program. It was a good program, for a long time.
So what's that? What would that do for you then?
Well, that gives you income. So you would have, you put in a conservation reserve program. It gives wildlife habitat. It gives you runoff control. It gives you filter strips. and you're paid for that.
On an annual basis, or
Yes, on an annual basis, yes.
Yeah. So that's something through the state or federal.
Well, the state has their own. It's called Maryland Buffer Initiative, and then USDA Nation has a conservation reserve program, conservation reserve enhancement program, and there's other programs to deal with sort of buffer control. But it's just I'm not familiar with the mitigation part of it. I would like to know what it was, but
yeah, I mean that could be the only one I can think of right now. I'm not sure if there's any sort of like crop mitigation technique or anything, you know. I think that's part of what that research was about at the beginning, and then it sort of took a turn into how can you like adapt to the situation rather than try to push it back.
Yeah, and the problem with some of these additives that you can add into your soil and take off your soil, you know, like in Nebraska, they have problem with salt in Nebraska, but they irrigate with salt water, you know, so it gets in the top tiers of the soil, and you can put gypsum on it to take that off. But here, it doesn't. It's just a waste of money if you're going to try to heal something that's just going to flood again next year. So.
Right. That makes sense.
Yep.
Okay. I don't know. I'm trying to think of if there's any closing thoughts on this other than what you've just discussed. I mean, your immediate plans are just to keep going. And I mean, what's your immediate plans here in the next year?
Well, it's becoming more and more prevalent. It's becoming more and more open to the public now, and people are talking about it more and more and more. So I think more and more research is getting done on it. So maybe we'll start finding some answers here in a year or two and come up with something. I'm sure that people were working on it. So
in the meantime, you're still going to stay connected to some of these researchers you were working with?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yep, absolutely.
Yeah, that's great. Well, again, I mean, like you said, you more and more people contact you. That'll happen if you keep saying yes to things.
Right.
So, but like today, I mean, I appreciate your time. Thanks for coming and talking with me. It's nice to hear from someone that this is directly impacting.
Yep, my pleasure.
Yeah. Well, thank you.
All right.
Have a good one.
See ya.